In this lesson, we'll be applying mechanical thinking to one of our thumbnails and refining its design. Now that we've taken a look at how to approach mechanical design, we can go back to one of the thumbnails that we've done, and we can apply this thinking to it. In the thumbnailing stages, I mentioned that I was only loosely thinking about the function. This allowed us, at that stage, to be more creative and to generate more ideas, unburdened by a lot of the constraints that a design like that would normally be under. Now we can go into a different mode of thinking, and we can think more accurately and mechanically about how our design works. The way I generally approach it is that I take one of the thumbnails that I want to continue with, and I break it down into several parts. I then take these parts and look at them in isolation, seeing which possible design issues I have to resolve, and how to make sure that everything that I've designed will actually work later on. At this stage, my priority is just going to be problem solving. I am seeing this as trying to find all the issues that my design has, and trying to find ways around them. To start the process, we're going to take one of the thumbnails that we've done for the course, and we're going to select it as our chosen design. This means that this is a design that we intend to bring to final execution. So go through your thumbnails and pick which one you think will be the best contender. Moving forward with this thumbnail, I've identified 3 regions to take a look at. The first is his legs, the second is the arm, and the third is the abdomen area connecting the body to the legs. I chose to start with the legs. The first thing I did is to quickly sketch out the main shapes of the leg, similar to what we did in the previous class in our examples, and then see how the arrangement works, and then identify any issues with clearance or stress. In doing this, I identified that the negative space created by the knee on the back would put a lot of stress on this joint, so I've chosen to put some support structure there in the middle. Also, to account for the space created by the between joint that the knee is, I've also put a dampening structure there to make sure that is not under too much stress. As you can see in the first version I drew of the legs, they don't look the nicest and don't necessarily have the best aesthetic proportions. At this stage, this doesn't matter too much, since I can readjust these proportions as I keep drawing. Being reasonably happy about how I fixed the knee, I then went on to see how it connects with the rest of the body. I roughly sketched out the pelvis and the body, and then looked at how these two are connected. Based on the original thumbnail, I can see that there's a structure in the middle that holds it up. This, however, would have to bear a lot of weight, and if the body at the top would move, it would have a lot of difficulty keeping it up straight with just that one joint. So I identified that it needs additional structures in the front and the back to be able to hold it up more efficiently. I also identified that if I want the body to be able to rock back and forth or make any kind of motion, then it's best to have the support struts have the range to contract and expand. I don't need the top of the body to do much movement, but I want it to be able to do at least a little bit of movement, since it being absolutely static would cause a lot of problems for this mech's mobility. I've did this all just as more technical drawings from a flat perspective, since I only want to first take a look at what problems I need to resolve before I focus on the artistic aspects of it. Now that I've figured out the basic solutions that I want to use, it's time to try and readjust how I've placed these and readjust the general proportions of the body to try and find some improvements. Since the arm is very separated from the rest of the mech, I've decided to first look at the proportions of the general body and legs before moving on to the arm. This brings me to the second part of what this lesson is about: finding places to improve upon the original design. As at this stage, we will have to look at the proportions and how things are arranged. To fix its mechanical problems, it is also the best opportunity to start thinking about its general proportions. It's highly likely that your original thumbnail, while having interesting ideas, isn't necessarily arranged the best way that it could be. Additionally, looking at the mechanics might have meant that you had to rearrange some of the parts in a way that your original thumbnail doesn't necessarily work anymore. This means that we can now look a little bit at what kind of shapes we want to be dominant and how we want to place them, and then do this while we keep our mechanical thinking in mind. The first thing I identified is that in the thumbnail I really liked the way the legs came out. To me they were very eye-catching, and in the first purely technical drawing that I did, you can see that they don't look very interesting. So I wanted to push how big and dominant these shapes are to create a little bit more interest. So I've decided to make the upper part of the leg far bigger. This is not just to make the overall legs bigger, this is also because this means that I now have less even proportions between the top and bottom part of the leg. Then I also drew the body along with it and tried to think a little bit about the weight distribution of the body. There's a risk of him becoming too forward heavy with the way that his legs are arranged, so to have weight at the back would make a lot of sense. In this sketch, the overall size of the joints and the placement is, for me, a lot better. However, I don't like how much space his body takes up. It felt more dominant than my thumbnail, and I want to see if I can improve upon that aspect. In that line, I chose to elongate his body a bit and make it flatter. With this arrangement, I'm more happy with both the body and the legs and how they interact with each other. Now that I've done this, I move on to the arm. Starting in the arm, the first thing I try and identify is what I want the arm to be able to do. Its main functions is that it can expand a little bit from its base, and that it has an arm that has to be able to rotate and grab objects. This means I now identify the main points of rotation necessary for this joint, and then try and connect just with primitives where I think things need to be. In general, at this stage, I am not thinking at the aesthetics or complexities of the joints. I am mostly trying to figure out exactly which rotation axes and which joints are necessary, and exactly how I want to visualize those can be done later. After arranging some primitives that will show exactly where the rotation points need to be on the arm, I move on to its connection to the body. Here, I want the arm to have a little bit of range of motion. It does not need to do an insane amount of movement, but it needs to at least be able to sway a little bit in the horizontal axis, or else it would be far too difficult to operate. With this, I decide to have a rotation joint where its shoulder is, and then connect the secondary rotation point to be able to move the arm up and down. After doing this drawing, I thought a little bit more about the arm and realized I needed to rethink how it's connected to the shoulder a bit more. Here I fleshed out the between point between the arm and the shoulder a bit more, and allowed for a better range of mobility. My process in which parts I break down and how I break them down is completely dependent on how the thumbnail was set up when I started. For your design, you will have to do the same thing. You will have to first look at your thumbnail and identify which parts you have to look at and how to potentially solve them. Meaning that the way I've approached this might not work for your design. Try and look at the overall rationale I am using for doing this process, and then apply it similarly to your design. After you've broken up every individual part this way, it's worth trying to draw them all together to see whether or not things still work. This will give you a clear idea of how your mech looks when it's actually made functional. Before we move on with drawing the full mech in perspective, I want to address the fact that it is possible that going through this process, you realize that your mech doesn't really work. Some things that might look good as a quick sketch or as an idea don't necessarily end up holding up after you've looked a little bit closer at them. If this is the case for you, then this is entirely fine. One of the reasons that I do this part of the process is to actually check whether or not my ideas actually work. It's okay to discover it doesn't work at this stage, since this saves you the time of trying to make this into a finalized drawing and then realize way too late that it actually doesn't really hold up the way you wanted it to be. If you do find yourself in this predicament, what you can do is go back to your thumbnail page and see if any of the other thumbnails could be a possible other contender, and then repeat the process for that thumbnail. For this drawing, we're not going to go into much detail. We just want a very simple perspective drawing that just shows the basic points of rotation and basic mechanical ideas. This means that you can visualize a lot of the joints just with simple primitives that show what rotation they should be capable of. We will start, similarly to how we did the thumbnails, by just doing the perspective build-up for its basic proportions. Since we now have a bit more specificity to exactly what dimensions the shapes are and what kind of space they have to take up and how they connect, we have to be a little bit more accurate with our perspective build-up. However, it does not have to be completely perfect. It just has to clearly establish the shapes in perspectives and have decent relationships between them. It can be helpful to first draw the basic body dimensions, and then draw the limbs as skeletal points, which means you draw just the dots of where the basic joints are and connect them with lines. This will allow you to get the general posture and placement of the limbs accurately without having to draw any shapes in perspective. You can then use this as a base to place the main shapes of the limbs over the lines and the joints where the dots are. Since this drawing is just for explanatory purposes, it is best to take a very straightforward pose for now. Trying to give him a complicated action pose would make your life a lot more difficult, because you would then be distracted by both trying to get the gesture and very complicated perspective relationship of the pose right, while you're also trying to draw the shapes of your design. One risk with doing a build-up like this is that as the complexity of the build-up has increased, sometimes you can end up with too many lines to be able to see what you're exactly doing. This can be an example of not seeing the forest through the trees. If there's too many perspective lines that you're using in your drawing, you will stop being able to know which ones actually represent which shapes. To avoid this, either try and erase perspective lines when they're unneeded, or try and simplify shapes very heavily after you know their basic space. Try and just move a pen in the direction of the guideline so that you know the connection, you see the guideline, but you don't actually draw it. Or do the first build-up with a very, very light pen, and when you feel like a shape has been clarified enough, take a slightly darker gray pen and then go over this shape to make it pop. This would essentially be doing several bases over each other, with each one having less lines necessary to explain the shapes. Try and just use these tools for when you feel you need them. If your build-up is going okay without needing it, then there's no need to make your life more complicated. Just see these as ways out when you feel like you're starting to lose your ability to read your own drawing. After your base is finished, we're going to draw over it exactly the same way we did with our initial thumbnails. This time, since it's all about explaining the shapes, the proportions, and the joints, we're going to draw everything essentially as if they're just primitives. What you want to focus on this drawing is not to have your shapes incredibly accurate or designed, it's more to have the general space that they take up be correct. You mostly want to see the overall proportions and where the joints are. One of the reasons that we only really want to approximate them here, and we don't necessarily have to go much farther, is that if we want to use this base to try and draw over later, which we will do at some point, then it will be a lot harder the more detail you've put in the shapes in this build-up. If you give yourself enough space to still make changes if you want to draw over it, it'll be easier to make changes as you want to add details in a later design stage. As you're drawing the final line art, feel free to keep thinking about the mechanical design that you were doing before. Sometimes you can realize that you have missed something as you were drawing. For example, in my initial breakdown of each part, I didn't look at how the hips and the legs connected very accurately. As a result, in my build-up, I actually placed an extra cylinder there to show that the legs would be able to rotate somewhat. If that wasn't possible, it would not be able to reposition its legs, since the rest of the legs don't have any rotation points that allow it to make any horizontal rotation. The task for this class will be to go through this process for your chosen thumbnail. I want you to look at the thumbnail, break down which parts need addressing or need further explanation, and then look at each of these parts in a purely technical way to see how you have to solve them. After you've done that, I want you to draw your mech in perspective using the kind of primitives that I showed in my example.